The person you're becoming is killing the person you've been. And no one warned you that it would feel exactly like dying. Not metaphorically, not poetically. Your nervous system cannot distinguish between the death of your identity and the death of your body. So when you start becoming who you actually are, every cell in you screams to stop, to go back, to return to the familiar version of yourself that kept you safe, even though it was slowly suffocating you. Carl Jung watched this process destroy people, not because transformation itself was destructive, but because no one had ever told them the truth about what becoming yourself actually costs. His patients would arrive in his office mid-collapse, convinced something had gone horribly wrong. They were losing relationships, losing motivation, losing the ability to perform the version of themselves that had worked for decades. They thought they were breaking down. Jung recognized they were breaking open, but he also recognized something the modern self-help world refuses to acknowledge, that breaking open is one of the most painful experiences a human being can endure, and pretending otherwise is a betrayal of everyone going through it. Today I'm going to show you what Jung discovered about why becoming yourself hurts so much, the 3 specific losses that make this process feel unbearable, and why the pain you're experiencing right now isn't a sign that something's wrong with you. It's evidence that something is finally devastatingly right. Jung's understanding of this pain came from a concept he spent his entire career developing. He called it individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole by integrating all the parts of yourself you've been forced to reject, deny, and hide. On paper, individuation sounds beautiful. Become your true self, integrate your shadow, achieve wholeness. But Jung was honest about what this process actually looked like from the inside, and it looked nothing like the serene journey toward enlightenment that people imagine. Individuation requires dismantling the false self you built to survive. And that false self isn't just a mask you can remove. It's fused to your nervous system, woven into your relationships, embedded in your career, tangled into every choice you've made for years or decades. You can't just decide to be authentic and have it happen cleanly. You have to tear away structures that are attached to living tissue, and that tearing is where the pain comes from. Jung observed that most people begin individuation not by choice, but by crisis. Something collapses, a relationship, a career, their health, their belief system. And in that collapse, the false self can no longer hold. The persona they've been maintaining cracks, and what's underneath starts pushing through whether they're ready or not. This is why becoming yourself rarely starts with inspiration. It starts with devastation. It starts with the life you built on a false foundation finally crumbling, and you standing in the rubble wondering who you are without the structure that defined you. The first thing Jung discovered about why this process is so painful is something almost no one discusses honestly. Becoming yourself requires grieving a person who never existed, the version of you that your parents wanted, the version that your culture approved of, the version that kept everyone comfortable. That person felt real. You invested years performing them. You sacrificed genuine desires, authentic reactions, real preferences to maintain them. And now, in the process of becoming who you actually are, you have to accept that the person you thought you were, the one who earned approval, who fit in, who knew their place, was a construction, a survival strategy, an elaborate performance that you mistook for identity. This grief is unlike any other because you're mourning something that was never alive. You're grieving the loss of a self that was never real, and yet that self is all you've known. Jung called the persona the mask we present to the world, but he recognized that most people don't experience it as a mask. They experience it as themselves. So when individuation begins stripping away the persona, it doesn't feel like removing a mask. It feels like removing your face. Think about someone who spent 30 years being the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who never complained, never made demands, never prioritized themselves. That wasn't a role they chose. That was survival. That was the version of themselves that received love, or at least received tolerance. And now something inside them is rejecting that identity. They're losing the ability to perform it. They're waking up exhausted by the performance without knowing why. They're feeling resentment toward the very people they've spent decades accommodating. And instead of recognizing this as the beginning of authenticity, they feel like they're becoming a bad person. Jung saw this constantly. Patients who were finally becoming real interpreted the process as moral failure. They thought something was wrong with them because they could no longer maintain the false self. They felt guilty for having needs, ashamed for setting boundaries, terrified that without the persona, no one would love the person underneath. And that terror wasn't irrational, because in many cases, the people around them had only ever loved the performance. The persona was the price of admission to their relationships, and dropping the persona meant risking everything they'd built. This is the cruelty of individuation that Jung documented with unflinching honesty. Becoming yourself means discovering which of your relationships were built on who you actually are, and which were built on who you were pretending to be. And you don't get to know the answer in advance. You only find out by becoming real and watching what survives. The second source of pain Jung identified is the confrontation with the shadow. Every quality you rejected about yourself, every emotion you deemed unacceptable, every impulse you buried because it threatened your persona, all of it lives in the shadow, and individuation demands that you face it, not theoretically, not intellectually, but experientially, in the raw, destabilizing encounter with parts of yourself you've spent a lifetime avoiding. Jung found that the shadow contains not just what we consider dark, but what we consider incompatible with our identity. The people-pleaser's shadow contains their rage. The caretaker's shadow contains their selfishness. The strong one's shadow contains their vulnerability. The peacekeeper's shadow contains their aggression. These aren't defects. They're amputated parts of a whole person, and retrieving them feels like reaching into a wound. The pain of shadow work comes from the collision between who you believe you are and who you actually are. You've told yourself a story about your identity for years. I'm the kind person. I'm the patient one. I'm the one who never gets angry. And then individuation shows you the moments you were cruel and chose not to see it. The times your patience was actually cowardice. The rage you've been stuffing so deep that it's been leaking out as passive aggression, chronic illness, or sudden explosions that terrify you. Facing this doesn't feel like growth. It feels like finding out you're the villain in a story you thought you were the hero of. Jung described patients who went through genuine shadow integration as experiencing a kind of moral vertigo. Everything they believed about themselves was called into question. Their goodness, their motives, their relationships. Not because they were bad people, but because they were finally seeing themselves as whole people. And whole people contain everything: generosity and selfishness, compassion and cruelty, love and indifference. This is where most people try to stop the process. The confrontation with the shadow is so destabilizing that the psyche screams for relief. Go back to the persona. Return to the performance. At least the false self was comfortable. At least you knew who you were, even if that knowing was a lie. Jung called this the regression temptation, and he watched many patients succumb to it. They'd get close to genuine integration, and then retreat into the familiar false self, because the truth about who they were felt unbearable. But Jung also observed that you can't unknow what you've seen. Once the shadow has been glimpsed, the persona never fits quite right again. You can try to resume the performance, but now you know it's a performance. You can try to return to unconsciousness, but awareness doesn't have a reverse gear. So you're caught in what Jung considered the most painful psychological position possible, too aware to go back, too terrified to go forward, suspended between the death of who you were and the birth of who you're becoming, belonging to neither. Before we continue, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get true self-discovery. The third loss that makes becoming yourself so painful is the one Jung considered most devastating and least understood. It's the loss of belonging. When you begin to individuate, you don't just lose a false self. You lose your place in every system that required the false self to function. Your family assigned you a role. Your friendships were built around certain dynamics. Your workplace valued a specific version of you. Your romantic relationship depended on patterns you maintained without questioning. And when you start becoming real, every single one of those systems feels the disruption. Jung described the individuating person as someone who becomes a foreign body in their own life. The family starts treating you differently because you're no longer playing your assigned role. Friends become uncomfortable because the dynamic has shifted. Colleagues don't know how to relate to you without the familiar persona. And the people closest to you often respond not with support, but with resistance, because your transformation threatens the equilibrium they depend on. This isn't because these people are evil, it's because systems resist change. Jung understood that relationships function as psychological ecosystems. Everyone occupies a position, everyone plays a part, and when one person fundamentally changes, the entire system is destabilized. The family scapegoat who stops accepting blame disrupts the family's method of managing shame. The caretaker who stops sacrificing themselves removes the resource everyone depended on. The peacekeeper who starts speaking truth destroys the illusion of harmony everyone was invested in maintaining. The pain here isn't just interpersonal, it's existential, because belonging is a fundamental human need. We're wired for connection, for inclusion, for the sense that we have a place among others. And individuation temporarily strips that away. You no longer fit where you used to fit, and you haven't yet found where you belong as the person you're becoming. Jung called this the liminal space, the threshold between old identity and new, where you belong nowhere. This is where the loneliness becomes almost unbearable. Not social loneliness, something deeper. The loneliness of being mid-transformation in a world that has no framework for what you're experiencing. You can't explain it to the people around you because they see the changes as problems. You're becoming distant. You're becoming selfish. You're not yourself anymore. And they're right. You're not yourself anymore. But the self you're leaving behind was never actually you. And the self you're becoming hasn't fully arrived yet. So you exist in this excruciating gap where no version of you feels solid or real. Jung observed that this liminal period was where most people's transformations stalled or collapsed, not because they lacked courage or insight, but because the isolation was too complete. Humans aren't built to sustain prolonged disconnection from belonging, so they'd compromise. They'd become partially authentic, real enough to feel some relief from the persona, but not so real that they lost their place in their systems entirely. Jung called these half-individuated people, and he considered their position more painful than either full unconsciousness or full individuation. Because they could see clearly enough to know they were compromising, but they couldn't bear the cost of going all the way. What Jung found essential during this phase was what he called the container, some structure or relationship that could hold the transformation without trying to stop it. For some patients, that was therapy itself. For others, it was a single relationship with someone who could witness the process without flinching. For a few, it was creative expression that gave the transformation somewhere to go other than just internal pressure. The point was that individuation cannot happen in complete isolation, even though it feels profoundly isolating. You need at least one witness, one person or practice that says, "I see what's happening and I'm not running." But Jung was ruthlessly honest about something else. Even with a container, even with support, the process still hurts. There's no version of becoming yourself that avoids the pain. You can't individuate comfortably. You can't integrate your shadow gently. You can't shed your persona without feeling skinless. The pain isn't a sign that you're doing it wrong. The pain is the process. And anyone telling you that transformation should feel like expansion and joy and flow is selling you another persona to replace the one that's dying. This is what no one tells you. The self-help world frames personal growth as addition. You add mindfulness, you add gratitude, you add better habits. You become an improved version of who you already are. But individuation isn't addition, it's subtraction, it's loss. It's the systematic stripping away of everything you are not, so that what remains is what you actually are. And that stripping doesn't feel like liberation while it's happening. It feels like being destroyed. Jung noticed that patients who understood this paradox move through the process differently, not with less pain, but with less panic. When you know that the dissolution is part of the design, you stop interpreting it as failure. When you understand that the grief is evidence of real change rather than proof that something's wrong, you can hold the grief without being consumed by it. When you recognize that the loneliness is temporary even though it feels permanent, you can endure it without retreating into a false self just to escape the isolation. He also discovered that the pain changes quality as individuation progresses. In the early stages, the pain is sharp. It's the acute loss of identity, the shock of seeing your shadow, the sudden fracture in relationships. But as integration deepens, the pain becomes something different, a kind of tender ache, the soreness of muscles that are learning to carry weight differently. Not the agony of destruction, but the discomfort of reconstruction. You're being rebuilt from the inside, and the new structure hasn't fully set yet. Everything feels raw, exposed, unfamiliar, but the panic starts to subside because underneath the unfamiliarity, you sense something solid forming that was never there before. Jung described this as the emergence of the self, capital S, the deeper center of the psyche that exists beneath the persona, beneath the ego, beneath all the constructed identities. The self doesn't need to perform, doesn't need approval, doesn't need to fit into systems that require falseness. The self simply is. And making contact with it, even briefly, produces a kind of quiet certainty that everything you're losing was worth losing, because what's emerging is real, in a way nothing before ever was. But Jung cautioned against romanticizing this emergence. It doesn't arrive as a triumphant moment. There's no soundtrack, no revelation that makes all the suffering suddenly worth it. The self emerges gradually, often imperceptibly, like dawn arriving so slowly you can't identify the moment darkness became light. You just realize, at some point, that you're making decisions based on something authentic rather than performing, that your relationships have become smaller but honest, that you've stopped seeking validation from people whose approval required your self-abandonment, that the heaviness you carried for years has lifted, not because your problems disappeared, but because you stopped carrying problems that were never yours. This is what becoming yourself looks like on the other side. Not a dramatic transformation into some elevated being, a quiet arrival into someone you recognize as real, someone whose choices align with their actual values rather than their survival strategies, someone who can sit in silence without anxiety because they're no longer running from what's inside them, someone whose relationships are built on mutual authenticity rather than mutual performance. Jung would want you to know something if you're in the middle of this process right now. The pain you're feeling has a name, a structure, and a purpose. It's not random suffering. It's not a sign of weakness or failure or pathology. It's the specific, documented, predictable experience of a human being in the process of individuation. Every person who has ever become genuinely themselves has passed through this territory. The grief, the shadow confrontation, the loss of belonging, the liminal isolation, it's the price of admission to your own life. And here's what Jung observed about the people who made it through. They didn't make it through by being stronger than others. They didn't possess some quality that weaker people lacked. They made it through by refusing to interpret the pain as a reason to stop, by continuing to be honest when every part of them screamed to resume the performance, by sitting in the loneliness without letting it convince them that connection was only possible through falseness, by trusting that the process had a destination even when they couldn't see it. You are not falling apart. You are falling into yourself, and the pain of that falling is the most reliable evidence that the ground you land on will be real. Everything before this was built on someone else's blueprint for who you should be. What's forming now, in the wreckage of that borrowed design, is the first structure that's actually yours. It won't be as polished. It won't be as impressive to others. It won't earn the same approval, but you'll be able to live in it without the constant, exhausting work of pretending it fits when it never did. That's what no one tells you about becoming yourself. Not that it's beautiful, not that it's enlightening, not that it feels like coming home. Those things might be true eventually, but first, it feels like losing everything, like the ground opening up, like being asked to trust a process that looks, from the inside, indistinguishable from destruction. Jung spent his life studying this transformation, and the most important thing he discovered wasn't a technique or a concept or a framework. It was this simple, devastating, liberating truth. The pain of becoming yourself is not the obstacle to your transformation. It is the transformation, and the only way out is through. If you haven't yet, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.